Thank you very much, Cheryl. And thank you, Ben, for your generous contributions in recent years in promoting the authorship question and in the case for Edward de Vere. Incidentally, I want to recommend Earl 17 wines. They're outstanding. So any of you are interested in that, you should reach out to Ben or make a contribution and receive the benefit of that. And in his purchase of the Herodotus, that prompts me to give a talk on Titus Andronicus, a drama I've never actually seen staged, despite the fact that it was performed at the festival here 20 years ago, partly because of my aversion to violence. As an emergency physician, I'd seen the consequences of it frequently enough that I didn't really want to feel obliged to go see a play that indulged in that aspect. I've had hair-raising experiences in the theater when it was very dramatically powerful and suffered migraines afterwards for the violence. So I'm admitting that I've never seen the play live, but there are some excellent videos that I will share with you, recommendations. Now, the plot of Titus Andronicus is probably unfamiliar to many of you. It's fictional. It's based on a series of fabulous and historical Greek and Roman exemplars colored by scenes of bitter black comedy. The resultant violence, murder, mutilation, it's all subversively stunning and unrelenting, actually escalating toward the end of the play. In the first act, Titus's eldest son, Titus has just returned from warring with the Goths, with bringing his Gothic prisoners with him. His eldest son, Lucius, marches off Tamra's eldest son, Alarbus, to lop off his links, to mollify the ghosts and decorate the tomb of Titus's 21 dead sons, all victims from the war with the Goths. Titus had already sacrificed the noblest of the Goths in a ritual that's described by Marcus. Now we want to have additional sacrifices. Later, Titus kills his own son, Mutius, for his protection of Lavinia and Bassianus, her betrothed. And then in Act 2, Tamra's surviving sons, Demetrius and Chiron, murder Bassianus, the new emperor Saturninus's brother, and then participate in framing Titus's two sons, Marcius and Quintus, for the crime. The offstage rape and mutilation of Lavinia marks an escalation in gruesomeness. In Act 3, the competition for the hand chopped off to ransom the lives of Titus's sons, who have now been condemned for murder, is rewarded with the return of their heads and Titus's hand. In Act 4, the nurse who was present during Tamra's birth giving is stabbed on stage. The midwife will certainly be dispatched. In the following scene, a clown is condemned to death for simply delivering a message to the emperor. Now, in the final act, it really escalates. Tamra's sons, their throats slit on stage, are chopped off stage into a cannibalistic meat pie to be served to Emperor Saturninus and Tamra. Lavinia is then killed by her father, who uses Livy to justify the murder. Then Titus kills Tamra. Then Saturninus kills Titus. And then Lucius, the future emperor, kills Saturninus in revenge for the killing of his own father. The heap of horrors reflect a vengeful passions sustained through artifice and represents the absurd. Now, the crime scene totals include 15 corpses, Alarbus's lopped limbs, 2 heads, 3 hands, a tongue, and wonderful revenge comedy. Well, very popular apparently in its date. So I'm going to launch into my screen sharing here with you, and we'll get going on the rest of the presentation. So that's a summary of the plot for you. So the title of my talk is Classical Mythopoetic Profusion and the Most Lamentable Roman Tragedy of Titus Andronicus, and that is the title of the first quarto. It's his early tragedy of blood, or tragedy of horror, you might say. Now, this is an image of Plato's Symposium, and I suspect if this were to be performed during Titus's era, the chalice there with the wine in it would probably be contaminated with blood. Now, there are several videos of this production of this play that I think are worth recommending. Julie Taymor, the creator of The Lion King, apparently had some success in taming the wilderness of tigers, that is the scene in Titus. I was averse to looking at this video, but in fact, I think it's excellently well done. It's really surreal in so many regards, but it doesn't lose dramatic significance. And Anthony Hopkins as Titus and Jessica Lange as Tamara are compelling. They're very quite compelling. However, I do recommend another version of this play that was performed about 6 years ago at Shakespeare's Globe Theater, and was, I think, an outstanding production of this play, and it really coheres, and I believe it's a superior production and done in the style that you would have seen on an Elizabethan stage, the way it's done at the Globe Theater in London, the New Globe. These are some images from previous productions of Titus. This is, again, a Globe production of Titus. You see Tamara there in chains with Titus with the great plume of his conceit waving in the air. Another image here is taken from another production. You see, once again, although it's not in the stage direction, that the Goths are all portrayed in chains. There's Lavinia, the innocent Lavinia, standing in the background watching this. This is the scene in which Alarbus is about to be taken off. And you can see a very butch Tamara there, very, very disconcerted by the situation they're in. Now, here's another image from the Globe production of Tamara pleading for mercy from Titus to save her son Alarbus, who's about to be taken off. And it's a beautiful speech. It's like Portia's speech for the quality of mercy is not strained. It's an excellent plea, but Titus, of course, ignores that, which is his first big mistake. And Alarbus is then taken off and created a situation that really is a impious scene where the blood from the dismembered Alarbus is spread across the tomb of the Andronici. Now, here's another image from that Globe production that is compelling, which is showing Lavinia with both her hands chopped off and her tongues cut off, with Titus there as he plots and decides with her how best to revenge themselves upon Tamara and her children and Aaron. And here's a scene where the throats of Demetrius and Chiron are slit and collected in a basin by Lavinia. The blood is then combined with the ground bones of these and the meat from their flesh and served to Saturninus and Tamara for the delectation in his special banquet in Act 5. I do recommend Jonathan Bate's edition and Arden edition of Titus Andronicus. It's very well done. He originally did this in 1995, and in that edition, he said, there's no reason to think that this was co-authored by any other. There's a structural integrity about this play that would speak against the possibility of co-authorship. And besides that, imitation certainly was actively engaged in by playwrights at that time. And yet in this 2018 edition, he has a 40-page addendum in there in which he reviews the scholarship of people like Dover Wilson, McDonald Jackson, and Brian Vickers, claiming that the whole first act and scene was written by George Peele, who was classically trained, of course. I have a problem with that because I don't believe there's any change in the theme and the language or anything like that. Besides that, you give to Peele the great speeches of Tamara and Aaron, perhaps the first great soliloquy of one of Shakespeare's villains. So I disagree with the interpretation. To me, the language, the poetry, the scene, the allusions, they all fit as a dramatic theme that works throughout the play. So I would argue against co-authorship in that regard, but he seems to have been converted by the recent research by others, including the Oxford University. Now, this is an image of the front page of the title page of the first edition. You look at this, as it was played by the Right Honorable Earl of Derby, Earl of Pembroke, and Earl of Sussex, their servants. Now, this is in 1594. This is the year before the Earl of Oxford's daughter will marry the Earl of Derby, okay? And then that his middle daughter, Bridget, is being negotiated for the marriage of the Earl of Pembroke, contemporaneous with this. So I wonder if that has anything to do with why Oxford would be a credible candidate for authorship of this play. First published, the first Shakespeare play ever published. And there's the first Shakespeare play, we have a definite date of its first performance, 1594. Now, this is an illustration. This is also the first and only illustration we have of a dramatic production of Shakespeare. This is by Henry Peacham. It was discovered by John Payne Collier, so its provenance is somewhat questionable. But here is Tamara pleading for the life of her son, Alarbus, to Titus dressed in a typical Roman toga, whereas his guards with him are dressed like English 16th century guards. Now there's Aaron with the sword held over the heads of Mutius and Quintus. Quintus and his other brother. So this represents. I'll show you the whole script from the document that Collier came up with, which shows the speech of Tamra wishing, for the mercy on her son. And then in the last part of it is the speech of Aaron. So his soliloquy is included in this piece. So both of those speeches were considered to be important by Henry Peacham at that time. The date of this is uncertain, but it's probably in the early 16th century. Now, what is the date of composition? Well, if you believe Ben Jonson's induction during Bartholomew Fair in 1614, it was probably dated sometime around 1586 to 1591, somewhere in that range. And most scholars assume that it was written sometime between 1591 and 93. And consider the fact that the Ovidian influence is so powerful in this. And so it's contemporaneous with the publications also of Venus and Adonis and Rape of Lucrece. Now, early 20th century criticism was very, very negative on this. T.S. Eliot, who was himself a classic scholar and published the 10 Tragedies of Seneca, called it one of the stupidest and uninspired plays ever written. And Dover Wilson, who saw a lot of parallels with George Peele's language in the Act 1, says that the whole play is a huge joke in which Shakespeare watched the groundlings gaping ever wider and swallowed more and more as he tossed them bigger and bigger gobbets of sob stuff and raw beef steak. Not exactly your great reviews. Now, Jonathan Bate hits the nail on the head when he talks about the fact, when he, in his edition, mentions that it's one of the dramatist's most inventive plays, a complex, self-conscious improvisation upon classical sources, most notably the Metamorphoses of Ovid, which appears on stage as a prop during Act 3. And he says that Titus is the play in which it's been beautified by the feathers of classicism and with a vengeance. He also says that. Tanya Pollard, whose book, Greek Tragic Women on Shakespearean Stages, has a lot to say about Titus Andronicus. And she says this, and I think this is a very concise description of what happens here. The layering of Roman literary models on Greek ghosts to form new English originals, the play's palimpsests reveal crucial debts to unfamiliar origins. And those origins are Greek history and Greek drama. Now, Jane Grogan, whose article I'm going to be really digging into here a bit, wrote an article called Headless Rome and Hungry Goths, Herodotus and Shakespeare and Titus Andronicus. And it's an outstanding article. Any of you interested in this, I will be sure you can get the PDF of it. She says here, and I think this really gives us the greatest description of what the dramatic concept of this. The play repeatedly and ostentatiously invites the viewer and readers to make sense of its plots and moral codes by reference to other texts, just as its protagonists do to try to make sense of their own situations. There are more classical quotations and classical allusions in this play per line than any other play in Shakespeare, including Hamlet, which is loaded. More often than not, the play invokes the well-worn classical texts of the early modern schoolroom and the homosexual communities of the universities and inns of court. Virgil, Horace, Ovid, Seneca, Livy, and a host of Roman historians and lawyers. And the spirit in which such texts are invoked is usually mock scholarly, sometimes brutally so. It shows the subtlety of the interpretation there, that oftentimes the quotes are meant to be interpreted ironically from what the character is actually expressing. The Latin classical sources are obvious. Ovid, and I will have some further things to say about that, but Metamorphoses impacts this hugely. It is perhaps the most important literary source for this text. Seneca's tragedies, Thyestes, is probably the scene for the theme of cannibalism, in which you feed your enemies' children to them, which is what Titus does to Tamara and Saturninus in the end. And also there's two direct quotes from the Hippolytus. One of them is a misquote, actually. Virgil's Aeneid has impact on this. And Horace's Eclogues are quoted directly in the text. Terence's Andria. Terence was, of course, a slave from North Africa and brought to Rome and then became a famous playwright, perhaps putting his name on other people's works. But in all likelihood, he was Black. He was probably of North African descent. So he may be, the fact that his comedy, Andria, It's a very dark comedy, has certain dramatic parallels to the text of Titus, and it may be the author's way of tipping his hat toward Aaron as a very clever writer. I mean, Aaron is a master. He's like a prototype for Iago. His plotting and his conniving and his unrepentant evil is quite remarkable. Titus Livius, Livy is quoted toward the end of the play, but is a source of several of the narratives within the play, including Saturninus and Bassianus, and Justinus's Trogus Pompeius, the abridged Trogus. Now, this was a work that Arthur Golding translated in 1564 and dedicated to his 14-year-old nephew, the Earl of Oxford, which I will have more to say in a few minutes here. Now, Stephen Sable, who also has provoked me into investigating this, says there's a lot of Greek in here. What do you think, Earl? I said, well, I'm glad to look at it. So clearly, Ben's purchase of the Herodotus encouraged me to do some further investigation. And certainly book one of Herodotus' histories is very, very impactful on several elements of the plot. Plutarch's parallel lives, many of the names of the characters come from Plutarch. Herodian's history of the Roman Empire. He was Greek, writing in Greek, but it's a history of the Roman Empire. And it's from his text that the conflict between Saturninus and Bassianus to see who would become the emperor is based upon. Heliodorus' Ethiopica, dedicated to the Earl of Oxford in 1569, also a literary source, probably because the black Ethiopian queen, okay, has a fair-skinned child. And she is terrified that this will end her reign as queen. And so she has it sent off with a shepherd to be exposed. Of course, the shepherd takes mercy on her, and the child Chariclara is fed by miraculously survives, and then later comes back and is acknowledged as the daughter of the king and queen of Ethiopia. But so the threat of a mixed race child comes from Heliodorus, which is introduced toward the end of Titus Andronicus as Aaron takes his son away and then is captured by Lucius and the Goths. Euripides' Hecuba plays a big role in terms of our identification with Tamara with female grief over the murder of their child. And Tanya Pollard has a lot to say about that. Sophocles' Ajax, the discourse between Laertes' son, Odysseus, and the other Greeks in terms of burial rituals and the importance of proper burial is alluded to in this play. So Sophocles' Ajax is likely to be a source for at least one or two of the allusions within there. And Diodorus Siculus, the Bibliotheca Historica. So a number of Greek and Roman sources. Now, the Greek tragedy elements in this are obvious. Titus's hubris, his pride, which is based on an unnatural sense of honor and loyalty to the Roman Empire, is obvious from the first act. His hamartia, the mistakes he made include the allowing the dismemberment of Alarbus, the passing on, becoming emperor himself, which Marcus offers to him, his choosing a Saturninus, who is obviously not able, it's a progenitor thing, but he's not a worthy emperor. And finally, the murder of his own son Mudius for protecting Bassianus and Lavinia. And then his attempt to deny funereal rights to his son, which is very, very sad. And because main burial rights is a big deal in the Greek tragedies, like Sophocles' Antigone, the whole story's around this. And in the end, Lucius has Aaron buried alive, and then he has Tamara sent off to be consumed by beasts and birds. So once again, main funeral rites at the beginning and at the very end of this play. Appeasing the shadows with human sacrifice. The Greeks did this with Achilles' ghost calling for the sacrifice of Polyxena at the end of the Trojan War, which then is part of the thing that condemns the Greeks to such miseries going home. And this is described in detail in the Trojan women, in Euripides' Trojan Women. Intergenerational murder. Titus kills his daughter. He kills his son. Tamara arranges for the deaths of Titus's two sons, and then Titus, of course, kills Tamara's two sons. So we have a profusion of intergenerational murder in this. And then there's the mutilation and the cannibalism. Now, the cannibalism, most people say, well, it's his Seneca's Thyestes, that's the source of that. But in fact, in book one of Herodotus, you find that the king Astyages has a premonition, a prophetic dream that his grandson, Cyrus, will depose him. So when Cyrus is born, he has his general take Cyrus to be exposed. Well, he hands him off to the shepherd, of course, and the shepherd's wife falls in love with him and raises Cyrus as her own. And then he's later recognized as royal. And in revenge for this, Astyages has Harpagus' son killed and then fed to Harpagus. Okay, so the idea of cannibalizing your enemy's son or sons, goes back to Herodotus, which is written, 500 years before Seneca got on this theme. All right. So insanity, certainly Titus appears to be insane. Maybe he's mock insane, like Hamlet in Act 4, but by Act 5, he's got his groove back together. He's very, very clear about what he's doing. He has great intensity, but there is a whole period in there in which he's shooting arrows toward the gods and ordering people to dig down to find Astrea, the missing goddess of justice in the underworld or on the seas. It is quite a crazy scene. The animation in nature also found within the Greek canon, when Titus says, these stones can listen to me better than people will, or he says, these beheaded sons, they speak to me, these kinds of things, that in the inanimate world still has an animating voice. And references, of course, to pantheon of Greek gods and heroes, particularly Hecuba and Priam. Titus has 25 sons, Priam had 50. Titus was in a 10-year war with the Goths. Well, the Trojan War was 10 years also. So the parallels between Titus's experience and that of Hecuba and Priam are underlined over and over again. And then there's a very brief sun salutation, which is characteristic of Greek drama, offered by Aaron when he sees what's happening with Tamara, and that she's going to marry Saturninus and move on. Here's what Jonathan Bate says about the supersaturation of Ovidian influence. Lavinia, reading the story of Philomela, repetitions of the Tereus and Procne story, where Tereus has raped Philomela, and then when Procne learns about it through Philomela's sewing patterns, kills their son and then feeds them to Tereus. And of course, they're all converted to birds by the gods at the end of the story in Ovid. Okay, but this is mentioned no less than 14 times. Okay, plus bringing Ovid's book onto the stage as a prop during the close. Okay, references the stories of Hecuba and Priam, Actaeon and Diana, Pyramus and Thisbe, to Orpheus charming the nether gods, to Sinon's betrayal of Troy, to the debate between Ajax and Ulysses, to the Centaur's feast, to the aphorism of Solon, and the Tarquin and rape of Lucrece 3 times, i.e. lots of Ovidian influence in this play. Now, he did write the book Shakespeare and Ovid, so I think he has a very clear understanding of how that works. He also mentions the sources of the names for the 2 people vying to become emperor. Bassianus was the name of the 3rd century emperor, better known as Caracalla, who vied with his brother over the succession, one of them appealing to primogeniture and the other to the people. In Herodian's history, and it was apparently available in an English translation, a tribune named Saturninus was sent to assassinate Bassianus. Okay, so those are the source of that names. Now, Titus, the name Titus is probably inspired by maybe the Titus who conquered Jerusalem. The Andronicus name comes from several different sources, possibly. There was an emperor of Byzantium who was noted for punitive hand chopping and for shooting arrows with messages on them. So maybe that's part of the source. But I think more importantly, there's Livius Andronicus, who was a Greco-Roman dramatist and epic poet who introduced drama to the Romans and produced the first formal play in Latin. I think that's the reason we have Andronici there. And of course, Andronicus is one of the generals that are appointed by Antigonus to form a military council for his son Demetrius, also another character described in Plutarch's Lives, Demetrius of Macedon, probably the source of the name Demetrius. Lucius, who will become the future emperors, probably derived from Lucius Junius Brutus, who expelled the Tarquins from Rome and is represented, of course, in the rape of Lucrece. Lucius is also the name of the first Christian king of England. So you have these palimpsests that layered upon, so that meant multiple meanings for these various names. Lavinia was named after the wife of Aeneas, and therefore the mother of Rome. The other Andronici is brother Marcus, Marcius and Quintus, Caius, Emilius, and Sempronius, the cousins. They're all clustered together in the life of Scipio Africanus in parallel lives. And finally, Aaron also comes from Plutarch's Lives, and named after a Tuscan man called upon by Aaron to assist the Gauls when they marched into Italy on the quest for who makes wine? How do we make wine? They wanted wine. Now, finally, we get to the juiciest part of this talk, and I've got 10 more minutes here, so we can do this. All right. Perhaps The strongest indication of Herodotean resonances in the play comes from Shakespeare's naming of the Goth queen Tamara, a close approximation of Tamreus, queen of the Massagetæ and renowned conqueror of Cyrus the Great, at the end of Herodotus' Book 1. She says, Herodotus is the primary source through which early modern readers learned of Tamreus and her achievement. At least one early reader of the text seems to have made the connection between Tamreus and Tamara. In the first folio, Tamara is misprinted in one occasion as Tamira. Now, Chiron says, was Scythia half so barbarous when they put off his older brother to be dismembered? Herodotus quite identifies Tamreus as queen of the Massagetæ and not of the Scythians. So they are the Scythian culture, but they're not Scythian. They're distinct from the Scythians. The Massagetæ, unlike the Scythians, were considered to be the ancestors of European Goths, also known as the Geats. Okay, so you have Tamara, who's queen of the Goths, and you've got Tamreus, queen of the Massagetæ or Geats, the Goths, related. So another thing that ties them together is that Tamara's Goth strongly evokes Tamreus's Massagetæ, and that Tamara's motive for revenge upon Titus, that he refused mercy on her son, is exactly Tamreus's revenge on Cyrus. And briefly, to describe what's in Herodotus on this, Cyrus is advised that he lay a trap for the pursuing Massagetæ army after the initial war. Now, the areas around Caspian Sea, and Cyrus made the mistake of crossing the Oxus River into Asia, which made it impossible to retreat. Okay, so the Persians lay a trap. The bandit kept containing much rich supply of wine. The Massagetæ were not used to drinking wine. Their preferred intoxicant was hashish with fermented mare's milk, and they drank themselves into a stupor with the alcohol deliberately left behind by Cyrus. Then the Persians attacked. Their opponents were incapacitated. The Massagetæ were defeated. Many were killed, and they captured Sargapazes, Tamreus' son. Sargapazes coaxed Cyrus into removing his shackles and thus allowing him to commit suicide while in Persian captivity. This was the big problem. Tamreus has denounced his treachery and challenged into a second battle, during which the Persians lost. Massagetæ got the upper hand. According to Trogus Pompeius, 200,000 Persians were killed in that battle, and with very high casualties. A direct quote from Herodotus. When the body of Cyrus was found, she took a skin and filled it full of human blood. She had him beheaded, and she dipped the head of Cyrus in the gore, saying, as she thus insulted the corpse, I live and have conquered thee in fight, and yet by thee am I ruined, for thou tookest my son with guile, but thus I make good my threat and give thee thy fill of blood. Now, further, this is Peter Paul Rubens' image of Tamreus with the head of Cyrus. It was a famous artistic image. There are tapestries of this images and medieval interest in Tamreus. Tamara is twice compared to Semiramis, the Syrian queen who ruled during the absence of King Ninus, also described in Herodotus and in Trogus Pompeius. Tamreus and Semiramis were both included among the female 9 worthies of the Middle Ages, and they were represented in the pageant which preceded Henry VI when he entered the Paris in 1531. So they know much about her. She's associated with Judith, who decapitated the Assyrian general Holofernes in biblical typology. The Mirror Magistrates mentions her positively. Robert Chester's loves martyr. She's described as full of nobleness. And finally, in Shakespeare, there's a reference to Tamreus in Shakespeare. In Henry VI, Part 1, the Countess of Auvergne, waiting for Talbot to arrive to trap him, says these lines, the plot is laid, if all things fall out right, I shall as famous be of this exploit as a Scythian Tamreus by Cyrus's death. Now, the Wikipedia article on Tamreus says, Shakespeare's reference to Tamreus as queen of the Scythians, rather than the usual Greek designation as the queen of the Massagetæ, points to 2 possible likely sources. Marcus Junianus's Justice's abridged Trogus Pompeius in Latin, or possibly Arthur Golding's 1564 translation dedicated to the Earl of Oxford. And I found that reference, the citation is The Reader's Companion to the Death of Shakespeare by John Benson in 2016. Okay, I have a copy of that book now. I had to follow up on that site. The Wikipedia actually gave me something useful. Now, you can get a copy, and I got this Gale reprint of Justin's history. It's not translated by Arthur Golding, but it is a 1712 edition. So I presume that much of the material is identical to that. And in fact, the descriptions of Cyrus's birth, the story of Astyages and General Harpagus, and Tomreus and Semiramis are all in book 1 also of Justin's history. Now, if you look at what Arthur Golding was doing in the 1560s, the mid-1560s, is quite interesting from the point of view of sources for an inspiration for Titus Andronicus. Golding's first publication was Aretin's History of the Wars Between the Imperials and the Goths for the Possession of Italy, dedicated to William Cecil in 1563. And 64 is a Trogus book that it begins with the reign of King Ninus and the husband, who was the husband of Semiramis. Incidentally, Semiramis built the brick wall that separates Pyramus and Thisbe. So just so you know, there's tie-ins even with Midsummer Night's Dream. The dedication of Trogus, Golding urged Oxford to let the example of classic heroes encourage you to proceed in learning and virtue and yourself thereby become equal to any of your predecessors in advancing the honor of your noble house. And then in 65, of course, he began to publish the first 4 books of Ovid's Metamorphoses, dedicated to the Earl of Leicester. In his dedication to Trogus, he also mentions that Alexander the Great carried a copy of the Iliad with him wherever he went and had it under his pillow. So he has a lot to say about encouraging Oxford to study those classics. So Jane Grogan, in conclusion, says that Shakespeare's play evokes a well-known set of narratives centered on the figure of Cyrus the Great, founder of the ancient Persian Empire. These intertextual resonances work not only in Tamara's favor, but also provides a positive moral cast for the play's central image of the disaster that has befallen Rome, the swallowing womb, which the detested pit that they throw Bassianus' body into, and where Titus's 2 sons find themselves falling into, and which is part of their way of being convicted. Now, Tanya Pollard, well, I'll just have one slide to share with her about this, about the use of Hecuba as an image that associated with Tamara. In the wake of Titus's sacrifices of Alarbus, Tamara takes on the authority of Greek tragic maternity, and Titus is linked to the Thracian tyrant Polymestor, who incurs Hecuba's wrath for killing her son. There is a specific reference to Euripides' Hecuba, as Demetrius mentions, the revenge takes place in a tent, a detail not included in the narratives of Ovid or Seneca, depicting child sacrifice and maternal grief, and bolstered by specific allusions to Queen Hecuba. The play's opening scene draws on Greek tragic models that direct sympathy away from Titus. This next slide, just a repeat of that. Finally, there is a lot of classical quotes within this. Now, I'll just talk about one. Terence Astrea reliquit. You remember, Marcus, she's gone. She's fled. That Astrea, the goddess of justice, is gone. Now, in Metamorphoses, Book 5, the departure of Astrea, the last of the immortals to be on Earth, signals the age of iron, the time of violence and social discord. The primary sins of the Iron Age, according to Ovid, is mining and seafaring. What does Titus do? He specifically directs his family members to go on the sea and try to find Astrea there, dig down to Hades to find her there, and then he shoots arrows into heaven to find her there. All right, so there's an ironic nature of Titus is saying that she's gone, she's fled, but he's doing exactly the kinds of things that are, he orders the kinds of things that would be opposed to that. And then finally, the Goth princes are idiots because Titus sends them weapons in a Latin quote. The man who translates in, the man pure of life and clean of wickedness does not need the arrows of the bow of the Moor. Chiron says, oh, 'tis a verse of Horace. I know it well. I read it as a grammar long ago. And then aside, Aaron says, oh, what an ass. You know, what a thing to be an ass. There's no sound jest. The old men have found their guilt. Chiron has no idea what the meaning of that is. And even young Lucius knows enough Latin to know that they've been accused of rape and murder. In conclusion, Titus Andronicus is an early tragedy of blood or horror that represents palimpsest of literary allusions and a complex, self-conscious, integrated improvisation upon classical sources, most notably the Metamorphoses of Ovid in one of Shakespeare's most inventive plays. The Persian context represented by Queen Tomreus and Tamara's associate with the Greek tragic icon of Hecuba reveal an underappreciated impact of Greek history and drama on this lamentable Roman tragedies. And finally, as an Oxfordian tags, to remind you, Golding's translations of the 1550, 63, 65 relate to this play very closely. That Oxford possessed Boiardo's translation of Herodotus. He also had Amyot's translation of Parallel Lives, and that Underdown's translation of Heliodorus' Ethiopia, dedicated to Oxford, is also a likely source. And now these are the primary sources. I'm glad to provide this material for you since I know I'm running out of time here. I have one more thing to say here. This is from Head Over Heels. Whoops, I'll go back. This is an image from Head Over Heels, which was produced at the Shakespeare Festival here. We are head over heels about you. And I can tell you now that I've walked the boards, taken a bow, and worn the crown on those boards, and I have fair witnesses to prove it as much. All right. Thank you so much for indulging me this wonderful opportunity to speak to you about a play that I had very little things to say about before Ben bought this book. Thank you.